a linguist's take on Rebecca Kuang's Babel and Katabasis, apparently. Hello there, lovely friends, acquaintances, linguistic enthusiasts. Today I'm going to be talking about Babel by R.F. Kuang. You might be thinking, hey, who is that person? And you would be right to think that. I am assuming this video might gain a bit more traction than my other videos so far, which I make mostly for myself in a very tight-knit circle of friends, like 3 people perhaps. But R.F. Kuang's fiction has left me with quite a lot on my mind. And so, rather than talking about obscure books or books that are currently not in the public eye, I am at the very least going to be talking about a book by a writer who is currently trending. So anyway, to answer your initial question, maybe you had a question, maybe you didn't. My name is Simone. I can't say my own name. My name is Simone. I'm a writer, a translator, and an interdisciplinary artist, apparently my script says. I work primarily in German and in Germany. However, since I'm bilingual, even though you can't tell from the way I'm stumbling across words at the moment, I've also written some of my texts in German and in English, and some of my poetry in English only. So, for example, my 2024 novella, Days You'll Find Me in a Place I Like to Go, has a German and an English version in the same book. What's much more relevant for this video, however, is that I also happen to have a PhD in linguistics. And I also used to work at a university, not Cambridge or Oxford, because I still wanted to, be able to live afterwards, but universities in Germany. My latest book, Nerd Girl Magic, is a German book. It's a non-fiction book. It's about fandom and geek and nerd culture from a marginalized perspective. In that book, I make several recommendations for more diverse and inclusive works. And one of the books I mention in that context is R.F. Kuang's Babel. And I make that recommendation both in the fantasy section as well as the section on dark academia in that book. Babel, in my book, gets mentioned as a positive example of diversity and representation, if you will, in fiction. And I debated for a very long time on whether to actually include Babel as a recommendation, because I actually have my fair share of problems with the book from a linguistic perspective on the one hand, and then just from a purely narrative and storytelling perspective on the other hand. So I'm not actually going to go through the book in detail or spoil any major plot points, but I thought in light of the release of Katabasis, it would be interesting to revisit Babel and my initial doubts, especially given how Katabasis has been received. I want to talk about how the criticism of exclusionary practices in academia in particular, and neoliberalism, as well as colonialism in fiction, can reproduce the very things that we as writers aim to critique. And this is perhaps a hot take for some people, although I don't know why it should be, why it's neither important nor worthwhile to be the quote-unquote most intelligent person in the room from a marginalized perspective in particular. Particularly a post-migrant perspective, particularly if you're going to be studying at an institution like Oxford or Cambridge. I also want to talk a little bit about bad takes on linguistics and translation, in Babel in particular. But before we get to any of that, I think we need to talk a little bit about R.F. Kuang and her rise to fame, and why I personally think she is as popular as she is. So Rebecca F. Kuang is a very acclaimed writer who has won many prizes. She is Oxford educated, meaning she went both to Oxford and to Cambridge. Babel is set in an imaginary institution in a colonial world that runs on magic. And then Katabasis is set in a magical world in Cambridge University. She's also written the Poppy War trilogy and its sequel, The Dragon Republic. And that's the first books that put her on the map. And that's a Chinese military fiction novel series set in an alternative universe of the mid-20th century. So you'll notice that there are a couple of themes Rebecca Kuang in her fantasy works likes to employ. So oftentimes her books are set in alternative universes where magic, for example, is real. Oftentimes they are very much Chinese-centered, which I personally find the most enjoyable about her books. And oftentimes they center institutions, be it the military, be it academia. Rebecca Kuang went on to write Babel, which I will be again talking about in depth in this video, which was very critically acclaimed, especially popular with the dark academia fantasy audience. And then she wrote Yellowface, which is a non-genre novel, as we would probably say in Germany, and she wrote that to much critical acclaim. And what's interesting about Yellowface is that there was a fair bit of criticism from the Chinese American community. For example, there's a good video by Read with Cindy, which is from an American Chinese perspective, that I think you could check out for an overview of the criticisms on Yellowface in particular. And then she published Katabasis, which has been met with very mixed reviews, particularly by an academic audience. So especially readers who themselves are part of academia, who pursued PhDs, had their fair share of problems with the book. And from what I've seen and read so far, I haven't read the entire book, I can absolutely see why that might be the case. But a lot of the problems that people have an issue with in Katabasis already were prominent in Babel, and that's why I think it would be interesting to talk about that. There are 2 more novels in the works, so 2 more novels that have been completed and announced, and one of them is a coming-of-age story called Taipei Story, which is set in Taipei, Taiwan, and unfortunately has no relationship with the movie. So that's the background on Rebecca Kuang. And now I'm going to talk about my major issues with Babel. It boils down to basically 2 things. On the one hand, this is a story about people learning to overcome colonial practices that they have been integrated into, learning to overcome the notion that they are in fact the special, the chosen non-white people who are allowed to learn at a white institution. And that, in my opinion, doesn't work for a variety of different reasons. There's also this idea that she's trying to pursue here, which is similar to what she's trying in Katabasis, where she is talking about very real trauma and abuses of power within academic structures and systems, or the horrors of colonialism. And she's trying, by proxy of the characters, to say something about that. But that falls flat because of how the characters themselves are framed. And this is, in my opinion at least, much more prominent in Babel than what I've read about Katabasis. One point of criticism that gets leveled around is that Alice Law, the main character in Katabasis, is not really a girl's girl, in the sense that she sees herself in competition with other women and doesn't have a lot of good things to say about them. But then I would say that in Babel, or the women that we have as important characters, one of them turns out not to be the best of people towards the end, let's put it that way. And the other can do no wrong because she's a black woman. And I don't think that's very good representation. But I'm not going to talk about that in detail because that's not the point I'm trying to make here. So there's this main character, Robin, who is kidnapped by this English professor and then educated by him with the sole intent that he goes to Babel in Oxford to become a silver worker, because the world in Babel runs on silver work, which is magic imbued into silver that basically runs everything. So the idea is that you need to have a word that is translated from one language to the other and has different connotations in both of the language, even though it is a translation, right? Because there's no one-to-one translation of words oftentimes. Magic is more powerful the less known or the more exotic, in a way, languages are. So the British Empire does what it does and exploits its colonies to find students who then can translate from one language to the other and be especially potent or create especially potent silver bars. And that's a very interesting concept. So our main character Robin is orphaned at the beginning and kidnapped by this English professor. I believe his name is Professor Lau. He meets Rami, a young student originally from Calcutta, who is opposed to the whole idea of the British Empire, because obviously, but it was a bit of a process for him. Then there's Victoire from Haiti, which makes sense. In the 1830s, as a French colony, people were sometimes, brought over from Haiti to either work as servants or slaves, more likely in France, but also in the UK. And of course, you also have instances where children were conceived out of wedlock and then brought over to Europe. And then you have the white British girl, so Letty, who's from Brighton in Great Britain. And so that's the character who is difficult. So that's the character who ends up not being the best because she's jealous and because of other reasons. And superficially, at least, all of those themes have a lot of merit. And I think that if you aren't as tuned to what's happening from a theoretical standpoint, it's not as jarring and you can focus on the story more. I think that from a narrative standpoint, I think the pacing is a bit slow in Babel, and it's at least not my preferred pacing when reading a fantasy action adventure story. It just goes very, very slowly. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about socioeconomic aspects or issues of identity, etc., or racism or colonialism for that matter, just in terms of how it relates to linguistics and what is promoted in the book. But a lot of the criticisms leveled at R.F. Kuang at the moment, in terms of how the academic world is set up in Katabasis, are already present in Babel. So in Katabasis, there's this instance where one of the two main characters, Peter, who works with logic and mathematics, isn't able to place a text that he's read into its historical context, which is just very, very basic when it comes to academia, to be able to contextualize, even if you're a natural scientist, the works that you come across, right? So that makes no sense, and a lot of people have pointed that out, that why, especially because our character earlier on does point towards the historical context, why at that specific point he isn't able to understand, or he didn't do research on the historical context of a particular text and how meaning might have changed. And from a linguistic standpoint, that's basically what happens in Babel nonstop. So R.F. Kuang has a background in sinology. He studied Chinese literature and linguistics, right? But I can tell, as someone with a PhD in linguistics, it's easy to tell that the linguistics that she came across or that she interacted with are on a fairly basic level. She probably did more research into literature, and also because the focus in Babel is very much on semantics. And so you'll have all of these footnotes, which is the same for Katabasis, right? Where people say, oh, you have to have read all of these things. First of all, you don't have to have read anything to understand Katabasis. It's fairly basic. It just has all of this additional reading material that you can have a look at if you want to, and you can then understand perhaps a reference better, but you don't need that to understand the story. And why should you? Because a good story, or any story, should be able to stand on its own merit. And so this is something that I had an issue with in Babel already, where I had the distinct feeling that the writer was trying to show me, or trying to point out, how smart, or rather how well educated she is. And I get that, I really do. From a non-white perspective of someone who went to a very white academic context, right? I understand how people can underestimate you constantly. I understand that people will, no matter what you show them on an academic level, will always think that you're not as smart as the most mediocre white male in the room.
Bruh.
So I absolutely understand that, this constant need to prove yourself. But I don't think it should be in a book. Because if I'm reading a novel, I just don't need that many footnotes. And what's happening is that, and I'm not the first person to point that out, what's happening is that she's doing this thing where she's trying to subvert an academic hegemony, and it's not working because she's applying the same rationale. She's using knowledge as a benchmark of understanding. It's a way of gatekeeping primarily. So pointing out all that the reader doesn't know, which of course you can do, and there's no issue in that, and people will perhaps find it fascinating to learn more about these linguistic aspects. But then you have to make sure that the linguistics, or whatever else theory you're trying to get across, is absolutely correct and is not as debated as some of these theories are. Because essentially, the main theory that she's trying to represent in Babel, and it's a theory that's very much been misrepresented in a lot of media, including but not limited to the film Arrival, I believe 2019, is a theory that's called linguistic relativity, sometimes also called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So Sapir and Whorf were two German-speaking linguists who actually worked at different times and who never penned a theory together. So the name of the theory is a bit of a misnomer. But the theory is based on their work in the 1920s and 30s. That theory of linguistic relativity, what it states is that language and thinking are deeply interrelated. And that is the case, right? But what that theory also implies is that if you speak a certain language as your native language, you are unable to understand the concepts of that language, whereas if you don't speak that language, you are not able to understand those concepts. And of course, you have certain words in certain languages. For example, in German, you have Schadenfreude, or in English, you have a word like sanctuary, which can't be easily translated into German vis-a-vis English and vice versa. But that does not mean that people who do not speak that language are not able to understand or grasp the concept. If you explain to someone what Schadenfreude is, right? So feeling happy at the misfortune of others, then they are able, of course, to understand that concept. Or another example that gets thrown around a lot is that the Inuit have hundreds of words for snow. I don't, in the languages that I speak, have necessity to be able to distinguish quite as much snow as the Inuit do, of course, in Inuktitut. But if I were to live there for an extended period of time, I'm sure I would use these words to refer to different types of snow at some point, because then it would be more relevant to my lived experience. And also, even if I don't know the words for it, if I am thrust into that environment, I'm still able to differentiate between different types of snow. And this is very important because, of course, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was exploited and abused and misused during the Nazi era, for example, and during other imperialist and colonialist eras, to say that certain people are not able to think in a certain way. And that's a premise that's also there or present in Babel, just that it doesn't really work, because in this sense the whole idea of colonialism and exploitation is based on the idea that people from non-white societies are lesser in their languages, in their abilities, etc. Babel aims to quite cleverly subvert that, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of one scene towards the beginning. So all of the students, Rami and Robin, and so particularly Robin and Victoire, to just name the three non-white characters here, but also Letty, right? They've studied languages at this point for a very long time. They are native speakers, at least in part, of the languages that they've studied and have translated basically for the majority of their lives now. And then they're in this course, and there's this white professor, and he says, well, languages cannot be translated exactly from one language to the other. And this, in this instance, all of the students, but particularly the non-white students, who, remember, all have their separate native languages, have all learned English and other languages, they should already be aware of this. Of course, if you speak multiple languages, of course, there's no one-to-one equivalent of languages. You know this. And then by making the characters not know this, by having them, discuss this in a manner that implies that they are somehow not completely aware of this already, that just undermines the capabilities of these non-white characters that you're trying to center. It's the same for a lot of linguistic theories where I just had the feeling she wanted to explain what she learned in her language course, or she wanted to put that into the book without really understanding the implications behind it. Because, of course, linguistic relativity and the idea of linguistic superiority go hand in hand, and switching it around so that the non-white languages are in fact superior to other languages doesn't really change that point in a significant manner. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem I've always had with Babel from a linguistic standpoint. Of course, you have a bunch of other things where it's clear that the linguistic theories weren't looked at in depth, but that is the main point. So therefore, when I heard about Katabasis and I started reading into it, I wasn't surprised to find that the characters there have much the same issues, right? And then the other issue is that the non-white characters in particular, and especially Victoire as a black woman, can do no wrong. So she's not a very three-dimensional character. It's very black and white. And I like my non-white characters to have very deep flaws, to, be very flawed, to be three-dimensional, to be human beings. And the final thing I want to talk about is Griffin, who is Robin's older half-brother whom he didn't know about, and convinces Robin to join the revolution in one conversation. And he throws out all of these ideas about, colonialism and oppression, etc. And we're supposed to believe that Robin at this point is a person who's bought into it, right? He's bought into this neoliberal idea of his merits being dependent on his academic accolades, that to get somewhere in life he has to have a certain pride also in the fact that he is part of Oxford, that he's part of this institution, and he wants to impress Professor Lowell. And now he's of course internalized colonial thinking. He's internalized that in a way he is, even though he's already met Rami and all of that, he's internalized that he's worth less than whiteness, or at least white academia is. And then in the span of one pub meeting, his half-brother, whom up to this point he's never met, is able to tell him, Great Britain, colonialism, they're exploiting us, so join the revolution and steal things from me. I don't think that's very believable. But that's just a me problem. As I said before, there's no such thing as a bad book. There's just your subjective opinion of it. And my subjective opinion of Babel, based on the linguistic representation, is mixed, I'd say. I still think that it's important to have Babel as a reference point. I think that a lot of the themes and topics will resonate particularly with people who haven't been part of this discourse for very long, who've just come into an understanding of self-empowerment. I think for that, it is still a very good book. But from a linguistic perspective, do your own research, do your own reading, and do that with all books that throw footnotes at you and tell you things, especially mine. Alright, I'm here just to say goodbye because there were some technical difficulties, definitely not man-made, that led to some of the video being lost, the video material, which I guess served me right for harping on Babel for as long as I did. As I said, I still think the book has its merits, and I think definitely for people who are just starting out on their journey of self-discovery from a marginalized perspective and on their journey of self-empowerment through media, it's a really good book. And from a linguistic perspective, I've explained those now in great detail. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!